Welcome to this introduction to the Risk Ranking Tool, part of the Risk Assessment Toolkit offered by the University of California Office of the President, Office of Risk Services. The UCOP Office of Risk Services offers several of these Excel-based workbooks to meet a diverse set of risk assessment needs across the UC system. Each of these tools has been constructed to provide insight from multiple perspectives. For a complete list of the tools available in the toolkit, please refer to the ERM website. This webinar is focused on the Risk Ranking Tool. This tool is going to help you consider risks based upon a list that you will create. The factors that we consider are event likelihood, time to impact, and severity, measured in three different ways: in financial severity, injury severity, and the reputational consequences. Now, it's important to understand that this tool is designed to help you make better, more risk-aware decisions, but it will not tell you what the right answer is. These tools function to support a methodical thought process that can be consistently applied to thoroughly evaluate various risks, enabling the user to make better informed decisions. Now, the nature of doing a risk assessment is highly subjective, and it only provides a user's perception of risks and related impacts. This is why it's also important to evaluate correlating data along with the risk assessment whenever possible to validate your assumptions. Inaccurate data or other information that's not provided by the user will naturally affect any results, decisions, or recommendations. Final decisions, of course, should be made independently by each organization using this tool. Now, with that in mind, let's move on to the tool itself and show you how to use it. We'll start at the introduction here by filling in some basic information about who's using the tool in these white spaces here, and we'll also save it with a unique name in a location that we can remember for later. One more note before we get started. When you open the file, you may get a warning about macros or security, such as this one up here. Let's open that up. So, please don't be alarmed by this. It's probably because the file has a macro to allow the data that you enter to be exported into a flat, comma-separated value file, also known as a CSV. Essentially, if you're planning on using this data that you enter here in UC's Enterprise Risk Management Information System, also known as ERMIS, you'll want to enable the macros. But the tool will still work fully if you decide not to enable the macro. Of course, please make sure you're adhering to any IT security policies that your organization has, and in some cases, your computer security settings may prevent you from enabling the macro. In these cases, if you wish to use the macro, you will need to work with your system administrator to alter your computer's security settings. Now, I'm going to enable this content for this demonstration. Click OK. And now we're going to move on to the next pieces here, just simply by scrolling past these instructions. Please read them when you first use the tool, and then we'll click on Get Started. So, before we begin listing the risks and assessing them, it's necessary for us to set some common definitions for the varying degrees of a risk's likelihood and various types of impacts. It's also important for us to set common parameters for evaluating the effectiveness of controls. Now, each scale here can be customized to suit our organization's risk appetite and structure. We provide some default sample definitions here. So extremely rare, for instance, is once every 25 years or more. Occurs regularly would be something we'd say occurs every year. Now, depending on the types of risk that we're considering, we're actually going to start with our weights up here in the top right corner, where we've weighted each of these 5 factors at 20% each. That means we'll weight them all equally. This is a good default if we're considering a broad range of risks. However, if we're going to perhaps consider a specific kind of risk that would not care so much about one of these factors or care more about another one of these, we can alter these weightings. So for example, if we're using this tool to consider risks that could cause workers' compensation claims only, then we're probably going to weight likelihood higher and financial severity lower because there are statutory limits on how severe most claims will be, but the number of claims is really what's going to drive our cost of risk in that area. So in that case, we could say that financial severity would only be around, say, 10% or 5%, we'll say. And then we would actually, and you'll see here that it doesn't total 100%, so we have an error message that pops up. And instead, financial severity doesn't matter so much, but the injury severity, we're talking about workers' compensation injuries here, we could take that 15% that we took away from financial severity and add it into injury severity and bring that up to 35. Also, if we didn't really need to worry too much about time to impact, we could change this one as well, bring this down to even 0 if we wanted, and then say bring likelihood up to 40% to sort of compensate for that difference if we wanted. So this is a perfectly valid set of weightings also. It's just up to you as the user for which of these you think is most appropriate for the type of risk that you're considering and your organization's risk appetite. Now, I'm going to set this back to 20 across the board. There we go. So that way we can, this is how we initially calculated the tool for this demonstration. Of course, again, these weightings will work across the board here as we go into other steps if you choose to change them. So let's go on to talk about our other types of scales here. We have them for likelihood, for time to impact, financial severity. Again, if we scroll down, we'll see injury severity and reputational severity. Each of these here has definitions that are set to what a certain word in a scale would mean. Now, these are scaled from high severity to low, high severity to low, high severity to low, high, and basically, so again, we have each of these scaled differently here, but the same structure applies. So this is how we can account for this. If we wanted to make a change, we simply say, well, instead of extremely rare, I would prefer to call this, let's say instead of extremely rare, we're going to call it extremely unlikely. Because that's what your organization would prefer to use in terms of describing likelihood. You describe it as in terms of likeliness instead of rarity. That's what we have here, but again, we can change it as we see fit. In that case, we would also want to put a definition here. If that doesn't change, then we can leave this blank, and we can still use, this will still use the once every 25 years or more. But if we wanted to change that definition, we could do so. So when we make this change here, and I'm just going to skip ahead for a moment here, and then I'll skip back when we actually go through the steps here. You'll see that extremely unlikely will actually show up in one of these here that we have, extremely unlikely. You can see here we've changed these drop-down menu options because we've changed the options in our parameters at the beginning. Now I'm going to, now this is a page we haven't gone over yet, and I'll go over it in just a minute, but I wanted to skip back so you could see that. All right, back at the introduction. You can also navigate. So actually, I'm going to delete this custom scale here. And so each of these different scales can be modified to suit your organization's needs. This goes over the next piece I wanted to describe for you, though, and that is these buttons that you see down the left-hand side. These buttons appear on every page of the tool, and they allow you to jump between the tool pages as you see fit. Again, you can see we just did it there. We can move back to this page whenever we wish by clicking this one here, Customize Scales. If I click it, it just snaps me to the top of the page. But we can jump around here to each of the different 6 steps in the assessment process. We can also jump to our summary and to our chart of events, or back to our introduction where we had those instructions at the very beginning. So that's navigation for you. So we've decided on our weightings. We've decided on our scales here. Now let's move on to step 1, which is identifying potential risk events. So this is a very simple, straightforward step, and that is that we're going to list the various risks that we've got here. Now here we're using some acronyms, we're using some specific language, This was actually completed by UC Berkeley's environmental team in their EH&S department. As an example here, we've presented this at other conferences, so we're not disclosing anything too huge here in terms of what they believe their risks are, but it's certainly worth considering and worth seeing that we have violations, releases, and then also HR issues, and then potential lawsuits or legal issues here. But also we've divided up violations into a variety of different types that they've. This is underground storage tanks here. We have some air quality issues here, wastewater issues here. So we definitely have a variety of risks, but all of these are sort of focused on what the environmental team there at EH&S believed were their risks when they filled this out to begin with. So once we've decided what our risks are, and again, this set of risks can be anything that we want to consider. You can make this very broad, such as you can include natural disaster type risks, or earthquake, fire, flood. You can include more enterprise related risks, such as increasing energy costs, strategic hiring decisions. You can include all sorts of things like that in this. It really depends on the frame of reference and scope that you want to use this tool for. It's a very flexible tool for that purpose. Okay, so once we've decided on the risk events that we want to take a look at, then we'll move on to event likelihood. Here we have these same ones that we've just entered, and then they get carried forward, and we're going to be able to assign a scale for each of these for likelihood, and also how effective our controls are at affecting this likelihood part of this risk. So let's go into this in a little bit more detail. What we have here is say this underground storage tank issue here. We said the likelihood here would be very common. So we're saying that it would probably happen multiple times in the course of a year. What we're also saying, though, is that our controls are significant in how they affect how often this happens. This control effectiveness is applied only to the likelihood factor for this. When we go into each of the subsequent steps, we can talk about how our controls affect those other aspects, but in this case here we're considering only how effective our controls are for the likelihood. So here we can say they're significant or nearly complete or moderate, and what each of these means here is something that we've defined right here. That we can decide how much control are we really exerting over this specific risk and this specific aspect of this risk. So once we've made these decisions here, again, each time you want to make a change, simply select the drop-down menu, and you can move among each of these to make that shift, or you can, if you prefer, you can actually type it in. You can type in over these here. You just need to type in accurately so that it reflects this. So if I wanted to change this to very common, I could, and you can see it can snap up there also. But I did say it occurs rarely here. I'm going to leave that. There we go. Okay. So now that we have these set up, we're going to go through the other steps of this. Time to impact is our next one here after likelihood. Click on that button. It takes us to this page. And what we have here is basically another way of describing how this type of risk will impact us. And our time to impact is important because it tells us what our advance warning is. For something like, for instance, a building collapse, we would have a long-term understanding of this risk as it develops. We would have other indicators. We'd have early warning systems such as we would be deferring maintenance over the course of years, and we'd know that we were deferring maintenance probably. Or we would have other warning signs, perhaps reports, trouble tickets being submitted to physical plant for this same sort of idea of a building collapsing. Now, of course, something that could also cause the same issue, such as an earthquake, would have a very low time to impact. We wouldn't really have any advance warning that an earthquake is imminent. So that would definitely affect how that risk plays out in affecting our organization. Something where we have no advance warning may actually increase the overall impact of the event to our organization. Something with more advance warning, we would be able to catch it earlier, and we'd actually our controls are more likely to be effective in that case as well. So here we have again time to impact and the effectiveness as they apply to that time to impact. So if we're doing constant monitoring, if we're talking about regular monitoring of something like that, that would be something that would affect our time to impact for something like this. So let's move on now to step 4, the financial severity. Now there are a lot of factors that can play into financial severity, and you can see here this is what we've selected for this set of risks in terms of our scales back at the beginning pages here. We said up to $7 million and more than that would be damaging, could result in insolvency or financial calamity. Here though, remember, scale really does matter. If we have one event that would potentially impact an entire department in this case, or an entire department could be on that scale for that department, one major event, major adverse event could be damaging for them in a operationally disabling way. However, that same event, when brought up to the scope of an entire campus, could be much smaller in scale for them. So what we've defined here as dollars, you could also define in other terms that would be more flexible in understanding, such as you can actually simply describe what the operational impact of these would be instead of what the financial impact, because your finances would affect your operations. So if instead this would be costly, where we would end up laying off a series of employees, or we would end up cutting back a certain amount of our program because of this, we can also describe that in our financial severity here. That's perfectly valid to do here. If we wanted to make that change again, snap back to customize scales and make that change here by describing what it meant, and or describing the actual short version of 1 or 2 words, what we'd want to describe it as here, and using as much of a detailed definition as we need for this here. Again, this serves to keep our frame of reference consistent as we move through the tool, and let us know sort of when we're comparing at the end, what are we actually comparing. So let's get back to financial severity. This is where we were. So that's where we are for this piece. And then once we've made our selections for this here, again, we can say that an underground storage tank would be costly in terms of financial severity. That means it would be up to $7 million in this case. And our controls are significantly effective, which means that they reduce the severity component of this risk by probably about 75%. And again, these are ballpark figures here. If you find something that's 65, you can round up or round down, however your risk appetite feels right. It's at your discretion there. So let's move on to injury severity. Now here we're talking about injuries associated with each event, and we're talking about for this series of types of risks, we really don't have many injuries that come up with this, with the exception of this one event, which is actually very well controlled as well, according to this entry here. So when we have something that is so low across the board here, this may be an indication that in your weighting, that injury severity really does not play a giant factor in the decision-making process for this type of risk, and so the weighting for this type of risk may be very low. Maybe you can bring this down to 0 if you wish, even if you have entries here. But when we go back to that customized scales paid, we could make that weighting change back. So change back to a lower figure. Now, we go on to our next step here after we talk about injury severity, reputational severity. Now this is, of course, the reputational damage associated with each of these events. This would include things like press coverage, political pressure to make changes to our operations. This would also include public perceptions. In the case of a university, we have a lot of other reputational impacts to consider, such as our future enrollment perception of prospective students and staff if we're going to make strategic hiring decisions there. The perception of the university definitely makes a difference in the long run for that as well, or for the donations of alumni. The role that the university plays in the broader community, because public service is one of the missions of the university. There are certainly a lot of other aspects that get played into this. So reputational severity can be measured in a number of different ways. For this one here, we've considered primarily, you can see here, press coverage and political pressure. But if you want to make those changes there, of course you can. So when we talk about this here, it looks like our control effectiveness is significant across the board. And with this case also, we've made one selection and applied it to all of them, mainly probably because we have a series of probably the same controls that would affect all of these risks. And that is that the procedures that a public information office or that the environmental team's public relations office would actually go through is generally not going to change a great deal from one of these risks to the other. That said, the different impacts that the variety would have here, the variety of risks would have, it definitely does change the impacts. So for instance, we do have some that would be more, for instance, this a release of this nature here compared to a sewage discharge, for instance. The two different are very different in terms of their severity, even though they may be dealt with in the same way and with the same sort of effectiveness. That, of course, is a decision that you are, as the user of the tool, you are able to make. So we have now gone through each of our different steps in assessing these risks. Once we've done all of that, we can go down to our summary report, and we have scores associated with them. Now, these scores are a raw score, that is, scores without accounting for controls. This sort of gives us the raw scale of what sort of a risk does this risk pose to us in the context of all the others, without accounting for how good our controls are. That's what this raw score means here. And then we can take those controls into account, and that's where we get our risk rating. Now here we can see that we have a lot of green and yellow. So the yellow here can actually mean one of two different things. We can see the two differences right here, release for UST and release for a contaminated soil import or export. And that is that yellow can mean potentially over-controlled, or it can be potentially poorly controlled. That means that in both of these cases, management should review these risks to determine if controls need to be modified and make changes appropriately. If we see something that says it is adequately controlled, then that's what telling us that your selections have been telling us that no immediate action is required. And then if one shows up as red for poorly controlled, these risks should receive immediate attention. Now, none of these as they exist right now show that, but let's actually go back and make some changes to show you what that looks like when it shows up and how that may be affected. So let's take, for instance, this wastewater risk, and we can go back to one of our others, and you can also see here that we have all of our entries in this summary page. Every entry that we've made shows up here. So the thing is that with these here, we do have we have an understanding of where our controls are strongest, and that's probably in likelihood and time to impact and financial severity. So if we go back to this, say in likelihood for wastewater, instead of being significant, let's say our controls were less strong. Let's say they were minor. And say their effective witness was minor. We can go back and change. Let's also change our time to impact and our effectiveness there. With this, it said it was nearly complete. Let's change it to moderate. And let's change one other aspect of our financial severity. Our financial severity we said was significant, and we also said that the the control effectiveness was significant here. Let's say we're unsure or don't know. In this case here, whenever we choose unsure or don't know, it defaults to the highest risk of the options here, because if you don't know how effective your controls are, we understand them to be not effective at all. So once we've made those changes, go back to our summary. And now we have potentially poorly controlled. So we've made all those changes here, and this is only gone from potentially over-controlled to potentially poorly controlled. So if we wanted to make it even worse, our likelihood would probably need to increase even more, but we can also just get rid of our controls entirely. And let's say that this was to happen more frequently. Okay, and again, each of these is only 20% of our total score, which is why making all of these changes together has that need. And let's see here. This also plays a part in the weighting, and that is we have injury severity, where a lot of those were saying 0. We have it weighted at 20% for this example. If I want to change that back here, change that back to say 5%, and change event likelihood back up to say 35%. Okay. We'll go back to our summary, and there we have this one has turned back to poorly controlled. And you can also see how some of these other scores have changed because we changed that weighting as well. So this is how we can make those, we can sort of reverse engineer this if we really want to make a change to show something is poorly controlled. But actually, those entries going into it here, I just wanted to show you what poorly controlled would look like as it shows up here. So with each of these, we've sort of made these changes here. We've sort of shown you what each of these looks like. In the summary, we also have a chart here. And this here, again, because we're using these sort of longer words for each of these, we have our heat map. This actually shows up as the higher likelihood and higher severity measures. Shows up here. We have this one that we changed a bit here, showing up as a large risk in the high likelihood, and also a high severity. It's a higher likelihood, higher severity risk now that we've made those changes. We can also see that this one here, this sewer discharge, is going to be a lower risk in terms of likelihood and also in terms of severity. If I wanted to make changes to this chart here, we can also just say, well, instead of severity, I only want to look at raw likelihood. Rather, we have raw likelihood here. If we wanted to say only a certain kind of severity without controls, say financial severity, I only wanted to see that. Then we can say we're only looking at financial severity here. And if instead I wanted to look at them with controls, read the instructions right here. It says selections in parentheses, use figures calculated without controls. So this is basically when we have our controls, this is what it looks like. If I want to say it without controls, then I will change this one here for our vertical axis to be financial severity in parentheses. And our likelihood, I will also change. If you have one of these in parentheses, one of these axes in parentheses, you should have both of them in parentheses. That helps us compare apples to apples here. So in this case here, we have without controls, we see that this wastewater violation here is actually, generally speaking, a lower severity, lower likelihood risk, well, moderate, I'd say, likelihood risk, but that when we take into account our controls, it becomes our highest one. And it's not that it is moving up and to the right, it's that these others are moving down and to the left and becoming better controlled so that their severity and likelihood are reduced. So that's this chart here as we go through. And again, if you want to make changes to these labels here, these come straight from our listing of potential risk events on this here, so we could shorten these up or sort of make changes to these names to maybe clean them up a little bit and make them a little less wordy. So that's what we have for our various reports on this. So you can understand how each of these risk events stacks up to one another, and where your risks sit, and also where your controls sit. So that is the risk ranking tool here. Thank you very much for taking the time to be a part of this demonstration here. I'm going to take you back to a couple pieces of information that we just need to let you know before we head out. When you have completed all the steps, you can export the data into a comma separated value file for ERMIS, the Enterprise Risk Management Information System for the University of California. There's an export button there on the summary page. So that's really the conclusion of this demonstration. Please remember that the results of any decision that you make based upon this tool will only be as effective as the accuracy of the data that you're providing for it. Inaccurate or other information will naturally affect any decisions or recommendations. And like any other tool in this toolkit, this risk assessment, this risk ranking tool is just a tool. It helps users analyze their risks and controls, but it doesn't provide answers. And now any questions you have can be directed to the ERM help desk at erm@ucop.edu. All right, thanks for watching.
Thank you. Please stand by.